Good morning, everyone. My name is Oge Onubogu, and I'm the Director of the Africa Program here at the Wilson Center. Thank you all for joining us today. And to our audience joining us online as well, we say thank you for being here today. As we host our Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Scholars presentation today on transitional justice and empowering women for sustainable peace in Zimbabwe. For those of you who are not familiar with the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, the SVNP is a continent-wide network of 22 African policy research and academic organizations that works closely with the Wilson Center to bring African knowledge and perspectives to U.S., African, and international policy on peacebuilding in Africa. Today, as I mentioned earlier, we are honored to host one of our SVNP scholars who has been with us for about 3 months today and will be presenting her final presentation. Ms. Nontando Ndhlovu is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science, and she's also of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, and she's also a researcher at the Center for Mediation in Africa, also at the University of Pretoria. Really looking forward to her research presentation today. We're also delighted that Ms. Jallo, who is an attorney and peace builder specializing in human rights, democratization, conflict prevention, and transitional justice and women, peace, and security, is joining us here today as well to provide comments on Nontando's presentation. So without further ado, I would like to turn it to Nontando. Can I invite those who are at the back to please come to the table? And Nontando, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Oge. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. So Zimbabwe has experienced massive political and social transformations characterized by violence, human rights abuses, and conflict. The problem is there's been a lack of understanding in how gender shapes the experiences of women in transitional contexts, and as a result, undermining their empowerment for sustainable peace. Peace-building processes in Zimbabwe have underrepresented women, especially in peace negotiations. Women have been absent. We talk of the Lancaster House Peace Agreement of 1979, which ushered Zimbabwe into independence. There was only one woman present, and she wasn't there in a capacity as a peace negotiator. She was there in a capacity as a secretary. And then we have the Peace Accord in 1987 that followed the massacre that took place in Matabeleland. No woman was present. Then we have the political agreement that took place under the Government of National Unity, and that political agreement, or that transition, which was designed as a transitional justice mechanism, also only had one woman who was identified. So women were also underrepresented during those peace negotiations, which is really concerning, because throughout the political violence that took place since independence and during the 2000s, that first decade as well, there was massive election political violence, talk of the 2003 election violence and the 2008 election violence that took place. There was massive gender-based violence, there was rape taking place, and people were being tortured, people were being intimidated, and some were murdered during those political violence instances. Then, as a result of the global political agreement that took place in 2008, that was meant to be a transitional justice mechanism to address the violence that had taken place since independence. That resulted in the establishment of the Organ for National Healing, Reconciliation, and Integration. And it lacked a very important pillar, which is gender. It did not have any gender perspective, and as a result, gender-based injustices were ignored in that transitional justice mechanism. The inclusion of women in peace processes, specifically in the context of Zimbabwe, was important post-independence, because when the liberation nationalists mobilized or recruited women during the Liberation War, they used the rhetoric of gender equality as being part of the agenda. So as a result, the expectation was that post-independence, women would be treated as equals in all processes, because during the war, they fought alongside men and they challenged traditional gender stereotypes. So that did not happen. Instead, gender struggles were obstructed post-independence. Zimbabwe's trajectory could have been different if women had not been marginalized from peace processes or peace negotiations, cultivating a more inclusive and equitable and sustainable peace. Historically, gender has been included in transitional justice and peace-building processes, identifying women as victims. But transitional justice processes need to go beyond the rhetoric of victimhood and include women in the very processes that design and implement transitional justice mechanisms. They need to be included in traditionally male-dominated platforms so that their role is acknowledged in building an inclusive and sustainable peace. And the requirement for the participation of women in transitional justice and also in peace processes is rooted in the broader framework on women, peace, and security, which was derived from the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and it's also governed by national and international regional frameworks, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, including the 2030 Agenda, including the African Union's Transitional Justice Policy. And there are lessons that we can draw from other countries that have gone through the same processes. For instance, in Columbia, after the 52-year-long war ended, women were actively involved in the peace negotiations and the peace processes that were between the government and guerrilla groups. And as a result of that, the peace agreements that were adopted after these processes were gender sensitive, and they included and prioritized the needs and priorities of women, including addressing gender-based violations that took place, during the armed conflict. And also, it gave voices to otherwise people would have been marginalized. For instance, the Afro-Colombian women, and during that process, and their policies that were implemented and developed sort of, integrated the priorities of the women, peace, and security agenda. We look at Liberia. Women were also very active during the peace negotiations, and as a result of their participation, gender-based violations were taken into consideration during that process, and also that played a contribution in their increased political participation and representation post-conflict. We see that President L.F. Johnson was the first elected female president in Africa. And then we talk of, there's Rwanda. Rwanda is another example. Women were really involved in the reconciliation process following the genocide. They were also involved in the court proceedings that happened as a transitional justice mechanism. They were involved in their capacities as witnesses, as judges, as mediators, and that process also contributed to their increased political participation and representation post-genocide. The Rwandan parliament has 61.3% of women in the parliament. That's an outlier in Africa and globally. So we see how when women are involved in these processes that design and implement transitional justice post-conflict, or when they're involved in peace-building processes by being involved in the platforms that design and implement the initiatives post-conflict, it really does play a big role in the governance structures post-conflict. And the policy recommendations that I think Zimbabwe should focus on is Zimbabwe needs to adopt or develop and implement a national action plan on women, peace, and security, where it's a collaboration between government ministries, civil society groups, grassroots networks, and women's groups. And this needs to be a process that has been sort of localized, a process that's inclusive and participatory, where they take a proactive gender approach, but also we need to take into consideration that an app is effective to the extent that there is government buy-in. What the US can do is, the US government can provide expertise and training programs to enhance the capacity of the relevant institutions in the design and implementation of the national action plans, and also facilitate bilateral exchange programs, funding programs, and also mentorship programs to build the capacity of local and community women peace builders in Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Nontando. I think you've laid out some very, very strong points there for us to consider and to think about as we continue with the conversation. Now, I'd like to call on Ms. Jallow to provide some comments as well to your presentation.
Thank you very much. And Nontando, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's really timely, and it really brings forth the plight of women in Zim. So thank you so much. I found a short newspaper clip. It came from The Guardian. It's from 2018, and it was a quote by somebody called Dixon Chibanda, but I felt like it touched on a lot of what you talked about in relation to the cycles of violence, so I'm just going to read it quickly. It says, 4 generations have had their lives marked by chronic fear. They've endured the liberation war, Matabele Matabele land massacres, enforced land distribution, the destruction of homes, and the general atmosphere of violent suppression and economic struggle. We're an emotionally and psychologically fractured people. History will repeat itself until we open a national dialogue to heal. People are hungry to take a new peaceful direction, but there has to be a collective and individual healing, and we need to recruit and train people from our communities to drive this. So I think really reading that that newspaper snippet really reminded me of some of the things that Nontando was outlining. And in her presentation, she's outlined the plight of women who have been survivors of sexual violence, of torture, of having their property destroyed, and in their daily life or fight for their economic livelihood. And we see that even now, that culture of fear, that culture of silence, of impunity continues to exist, even in Zimbabwe's gender-based violence statistics. I saw a statistic that said 1 in every 3 of women aged between 15 to 49 has experienced physical violence, and 1 in every 4 women has experienced sexual violence. And that is on top of staggering statistics in relation to unemployment, 19.7%, the rise of extreme poverty, 43.1%, low levels of representation of women in leadership, 31%. So I feel that what Nontando shares with us is the realities that are happening on the ground. So as we talk about pursuing sustainable peace, the principles of transitional justice, truth-telling, accountability, reform, guarantees of non-recurrence, I think it would be amiss if we also didn't address these basic socioeconomic realities in our search for peace. Otherwise, any search for peace becomes meaningless. And I think a silent question that comes out of Nontando's presentation is, why women? Why are women so important to the peace process? And there's a statistic that comes from UN Women that says that when women are part of peace processes, the outcomes of those processes are 35% more likely to last 15 years and more. So why are women the secret sauce? It is because of the issue of inclusivity, as Nontando touched on, that they're able to breathe life to the voices of everyone in the community. And because of their unique placement in communities, they're able to be a first point of contact for those in their families and in their communities that need help. So we see women as sources of connection and organizers in communities who are eager to prove themselves in times of need. And I think that Nontando's research reflects that. And I really love what she said about moving beyond the rhetoric of victimhood. We need to be able to really reflect on that and on the positioning of women and why women are so critical to peace processes. So in looking at the different opportunities for peace in relation to women, I think a critical starting point as well is to say that communities need to be supported in identifying their problems within their communities. And this needs to be research-led, it needs to be a data-driven transitional justice process. And what better to spearhead that than civil society organizations, community-based organizations, as Nontando has reflected in her presentation. And in that, channeling the critical use of women survivors, because they have situational knowledge, they have knowledge because of their proximity, and even in relation to hear untold stories purely on a language basis. So I think it's very important to center women in those efforts. And communities need to be at the forefront of designing the solutions and giving voice to that. Looking at short, medium to long-term processes in relation to transitional justice. What can be accomplished? Maybe right now, accountability in terms of criminal accountability can't be accomplished, but maybe truth-telling, truth documentation in the form of truth commissions could be explored, just to give the first step of being able to hear stories for healing And a typical example of that is in the case of the Gambia right now. And in that, educating people about transitional justice, I think people need to understand what the processes really are before they're also able to advise or steer their way forward. So I think those are some issues. Nontando touched on really critical issues in relation to governance. We need more women in political leadership, and we also need to create a conducive environment within these entities for them to thrive. So that would be in relation to the government, that would be in relation to the parliament, that could be in relation to the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, as Nontando has mentioned. And that would be very critical in passing key legislations or instruments in relation to transitional justice, including the NAP. And she very much touched on an important issue of mainstreaming and making sure that the plight of gender is woven into the daily affairs of all these different sectors. Zimbabwe has also signed the CEDAW. It has signed the Maputo Protocol. Zimbabwe needs to be reminded of its obligations at the international level. And just lastly, looking at the opportunities in relation to socioeconomic development for women. I think that is a low-hanging fruit. Every government wants to be seen to be doing right by its people, including women. So just taking a specific example of Zimbabwe introducing its new currency, the ZiG, what opportunities does that have to lift the livelihood of women in Zimbabwe? We see the statistics that 54% of women form the informal sector in Zimbabwe. So there needs to be an increase in microfinancing and lending for women, being able to facilitate access to agricultural land. These things are important because according to a study led by the African Development Bank Group, Zimbabwe actually has more female-headed households than men. So women are growth poles in community. If you better the livelihood of women, you benefit the livelihood of the community. So I think when Nontando talks about having an intersectional approach, I think that's really, really critical and really, really timely. When we talk about what the role of the US should be, I remember me and Nontando had a call about this and we were wondering to ourselves, what's relevant for US policymakers? Well, it would be to support civil society organizations in their programming, in relation to consultation, capacity building, trainings, in the form of funding, and also in relation to the funding of reparations. Nontando and I also toyed around the issue of sanctions. When reading the removal of the sanctions for more targeted sanctions, there was talk about addressing corruption and general human rights abuses, but actually that could have been a timely opportunity for the US government to also touch on the need for transitional justice and the need to center the voices of women. So perhaps that could be added in relation to the statement accompanying the sanctions. But with that, thank you so much, Nontando, for your research. It was really inspiring and really encouraging, and I hope that Zim does take an intersectional approach to transitional justice. So thank you very much for your research.
Thank you, Amato, and thank you, Nontando. Please join me in thanking you for this presentation. So we are, we already have a lot of questions from online. I will hold on my question and go to these questions that we've just received online now. Nontando, you've provided, as I mentioned, a lot for us to think about in your paper and in your research as we think about transitional justice and achieving sustainable peace in Zimbabwe. You've laid out case studies or examples, looking at examples in Columbia, in Liberia, and Rwanda, and lessons where we could draw on. Ramato, you spoke about transitional justice and being able to educate people more about what this means, because sometimes we tend to get stuck on terms, but what does this really mean in practice? And so one question that we have here is, could the both of you speak more on political or government will to implement some of the recommendations or plans that you've outlined? Nontando, let's start with you.
I mean, the Zimbabwean political landscape is very complex. And the reason why we are where we are is because of the lack of political will from the government to actually institute an effective transitional justice process. Why? Because mainly all these human rights abuses and atrocities that have been committed post-independence have been security sector led. And they've been sort of engineered by the government. So in the context of a transitional justice process, they'll have to sort of take accountability of what has taken place and what has happened. As a result, in that case, we will still have the past. We're still stuck in the past because transitional justice has not been realized in Zimbabwe as a result of lack of political will. So that has really been an issue, and it's an issue that still needs to be addressed.
But Nontando, yes, you've outlined, there's a lack of political will, but currently as things are in Zimbabwe today, do you think that there are any incentives that can be used within the country or incentives from outside that can push the ruling class or the government of the day to actually implement some of the recommendations? Are there any incentives?
I mean, looking at the current government, I don't think transitional justice can be fully recognized in the, looking at the current context. But however, a national action plan on women and women, peace and security should still be developed and implemented. That should, the lack of an effective transitional justice process should not impede on, the women, peace and security agenda within the context of Zimbabwe, because they have signed regional and international frameworks committing to gender equality. Yeah.
So, Ramatu, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I agree with Nontando that it's challenging in the particular time, in the particular, now. But I think maybe it might be interesting to toy with that idea of looking at different low-hanging fruits in relation to transitional justice processes and breaking it down according to short, medium, long term. Like I had touched on the Gambia experience, that originally they had a very good commission, so a truth commission process. Granted, that was under a new regime, but they did that first for documenting and truth-telling before they then enacted the latest bill in relation to setting up a special tribunal to try crimes. So maybe there's something that could be borrowed from that experience, that we don't have to necessarily go all the way, but maybe in relation to at least doing research on the ground and at least getting to understand what are the needs in the community. Is there a need for counseling, psychosocial support? Most likely, but it's always an assumption unless it's driven by actual research. And being able to allow people to tell stories and hopefully in that space being able to guarantee their safety and their confidentiality, I think is really important in the transitional justice process. And so maybe those could be the low-hanging fruits as a start. And then going forward as well, I don't think there's any country that wants to be seen as not doing right by women in their country and not achieving gender equality. So that is another a means of exploring in relation to lower hanging fruits, in relation to looking at the education of women, girls, also in relation to harnessing the power of the youth. I saw a statistic that 60% of Zim's population is youth under 25. So I think that it's really important also to look at youth unemployment as well as a low-hanging fruit. So at least in getting to the conversation around peace, you're making sure that it is sustainable, at least in those particular avenues first, I think could be a step in the right direction, which could be built on over time.
So, Ramata, going back to the point you made about Gambia, so if you could speak more about that context, the Truth-Telling Commission in Gambia, how was gender incorporated or woven into any of that work?
So the experience in Gambia was interesting. From what I know, there was actually a special unit for gender-based violence that was set up within that process. And even in relation to hearing the stories, there were even instances where there was a particular survivor who had suffered sexual abuse from Yahya Jammeh, the former president, and she was able to sort of tell her story. So I think just in relation to being very deliberate about ensuring that victims are able to tell, or survivors are able to tell their stories, context, that there is specific units that are dedicated to sexual violence within transitional justice processes, and making sure that that is accompanied with psychosocial support, that is important, and that's something that was sort of woven into the Gambia experience.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions in the room? Toby?
Hi, I'm Toby Glucksman, one of the State Department Fellows here at the Wilson Center, and I just want to thank you for that presentation. It's very interesting. I think you made a very compelling case that gender and women's involvement need to be very much considered in transitional justice. I guess I want to go back to the point you made that regarding political will. I mean, if we assume that that's one of the problems, but can we also assume that there's a cultural issue there behind why women have not been involved in these processes in the past, and what is, if there is a problem, what is the problem, and how might we tackle it? Are there examples elsewhere in the world where that sort of issue has been addressed effectively? Thanks.
Thank you for your question. I mean, absolutely. When we look at history, Zimbabwe has been, traditionally been historically a patriarchal society. We talk of during pre-colonial times, even during colonialism, even currently. Culture really does play a role in how the government structures, like how governance is structured within the political landscape in Zimbabwe. And I mean, in terms of examples from elsewhere in the world, that's research that will need to be done so that we can sort of make a comparison in how they've sort of dealt with cultural barriers when it comes to political governance or governance in general within nation. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other question in the room before I go to the questions online? Okay, let me let you all keep on thinking about your questions. Let me go to these questions we received online. So going back to the point on political will. Now, do you think that there is a role for regional groups or Pan-African groups, regional economic bodies in any sense? Do you think that they could play a role here in guiding the implementation of a national action plan or working with the government of Zimbabwe?
I think the AU can, I mean, sort of intervene in its capacity as the regional organization to sort of provide expertise and training programs to aid the NEP development process and implementation process in Zimbabwe, and also to sort of design monitoring and evaluation mechanisms to sort of monitor the implementation process of the national action plans on women and peace and security within Zimbabwe. And also, I mean, a diplomatic dialogue or political dialogue could sort of benefit, you know, the NEP development action, the NEP action, the NEP development process, where also, you know, we borrow from other countries looking at their NEP development and implementation processes, and then use that process to sort of develop guidelines on how to guide or inform the NEP development process in Zimbabwe. Yeah.
Okay. Ramatu, did you want to add anything to that, or I could just take the next question in the room?
I think I might be able to add a little bit to that as well. I think maybe just to echo what Nontando was saying, that they can play a part in relation to giving capacity and in terms of facilitating that process. But I think sometimes I'm also challenged by regional economic communities in the AU. I think that sometimes they can be a bit too far from the communities on the ground. So while they play a top to bottom approach, it would be for at the national level and communities to meet from the bottom to the top as well, so that there's movement on both ends.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Good point. Moses?
My comment really relates to this point about bottom up, and also connecting to Toby's point about culture. I feel very simple statements like the place of the woman is the kitchen, and several other cultural formations or socializations within the African society actually serve as a foundation of some of these events that we see. They may be remote, but culture is really integral. So how do we move towards some form of a gender transformative approach in handling these things? So everyday gender transformative programming is really needed. I see community level organizations playing an important role, especially NGOs and other local level organizations. But from doing research across Africa, one of the things I've realized is usually you need men involved in these processes as well. So sometimes when we talk about gender, we may be tempted to say it's better dealt with discussing with women. But when you bring men to the table to handle these issues, and especially even starting conversations about very difficult topics like women's ownership of land, which is like something that is always sensitive, right? But creating those spaces to start conversations like that can have lasting impacts. So I see the role of local level organizations, community level organizations in shaping that bottom-up approach that you talked about, and especially creating that local acceptance that culture is something that must evolve. But of course, that evolution has to come from the people themselves and not from any external agents. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Moses. It's a really, really, really good point you made there. And when you said, everyday gender transformative programming, ensuring that the voices of our local actors are engaged, fully engaged and included in the conversations and the outcome. So I want to throw it back to Nontando and Ramato, framing that question to say, Nontando, you've now spoken about transitional justice leading to sustainable peace in Zimbabwe. Could you talk further about how local actors can be effectively included in this framework that you're proposing, or how they have been included or not included, and what you think could be done differently? Ramato, I also love your thoughts and ideas on this too as well, as you think about moving forward, Nontando, in proposing this or moving forward with this idea and research on transitional justice. How do we effectively ensure that local voices are included?
Thank you for that question. I think we should also look at, building the capacity of local women, really focusing on grassroots level peace building and having those local women or local networks sort of informing transitional justice processes or involving them in the design, in the formulation and implementation of these mechanisms, sort of, emphasizing on localizing the process. Because sometimes we have women's groups and some of them are really led by elite women who might be out of touch, with the needs of, for instance, women staying in the rural areas, with the needs of women from the lower classes, with the needs of, diverse women. So I think it's important to sort of make sure that women from, diverse walks of life are sort of involved in the process, where we have community leaders who, have these conversations with women from different communities, especially in the rural areas, to sort of help inform, the entire national process, where their needs also are prioritized and considered. Yeah.
I agree with that statement, and I would say that the intersectional approach that Nontando talks about, the intergenerational approach as well among women, including also women with disabilities, trans women, and also making sure that there's a strong network already existing of civil society organizations, because they would be very critical in facilitating those types of conversations, making sure that there are traditional leaders, and as you mentioned on our call, having religious leaders as well. And I really love Moses's point about reverse engineering some cultural sort of proverbs or phrases that are used or maybe sometimes weaponized against women, but also even in those same cultural contexts, there are also proverbs that actually uplift women. So it would be interesting to center campaigns on those. For example, for in Botswana's context, we have the saying, "Mosadi ke thari ya setšhaba," which is, a woman is the lifeblood of the nation. So imagine reversing or creating a campaign on the importance of women based on that. I think we could encourage the evolution of culture and also keeping those important phrases within our communities.
So Nontando, going back to some of the points that you made, what then do you see as the major hindrance? What is stopping the government of the day from engaging women in this process?
I would really say culture does play, a very big role in sidelining women in these processes. But also, I don't want to make this as an excuse, but based on, the colonial gender structures that we sort of institutionalized in Zimbabwe, when we look at during the colonial era, the economic policies that were put in place and were institutionalized really undermined, the capacity of women economically and politically. And, one issue that I think is a problem is that this sort of patriarchal culture, because during colonialism, women had to deal with both traditional patriarchy and colonial patriarchy. And during colonialism, these were sort of institutionalized. And post-independence, there hasn't been a reform in the political institutions or in the institutions within the context of Zimbabwe. So there's sort of a continuation of colonial gender structures within the Zimbabwean context. And that has not been dismantled. As a result, there is that continuation of undermining women.
I think that's a really important point that you make. While sometimes we might think about cultural hindrances, you've also said there are things that are political and institutional, and there's an intersection of both. And sometimes some of the things that we might say are cultural may not necessarily be driven by culture in any way. It might be changing the institutions that are driving some of these actions. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I'm saying there's an intersection of culture and institutional patriarchy that was reinforced by colonial patriarchy. Because before colonialism, there was traditional patriarchy within the Zimbabwean context, historically. During colonialism, there's an intersection of both these two patriarchies. And then they become institutionalized. And that continues post-independence. So the gender colonial structures are sort of reinforced instead of being dismantled. There's sort of a continuation within the post-independence context.
No, thank you so much. So you've actually just given yourself more work in terms of research, because we would, that's really interesting, and we would love to see more of that from you if you actually go forward and research on this. It's really, really, really interesting and fascinating here. So we have just a few more minutes left. Do we have any other questions in the room or questions online before I turn it to our speakers to give their final thoughts or comments? Okay, Ansumani?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Nontando, thank you very much. And thank you also to Ms. Ndhlovu for your insights and your contribution. I think one of the recommendations I also would like for you to consider when it comes to women in Zimbabwe is to, conduct a sort of research to understand women who have the capacity to, lead peace and negotiation processes in the country. And in addition to that, having a database where all these women will be, their names and portfolios will be. So I think whenever the government or any institution need women, they could just use that, for that purpose. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. My final thoughts would be that in devising a way forward in Zimbabwe in terms of transitional justice, whether it's the current government or it's the next government. We don't know when the next government will be in power, because the current government has been in power since independence, since 1980. So hopefully, if things change and the government of Zimbabwe decides to take accountability of past human rights abuses, they would have to employ an intersectional approach in their designing of transitional justice mechanisms. They should make sure that women are included in the very platforms that lead these processes, and they should mainstream the priorities and the needs of women in all government institutions going forward. And they should try and adopt the priorities in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and they should be cognizant of their commitment to regional and international frameworks that they signed, committing to gender equality.
Thank you, Nontando. Ramatu?
Thank you very much. I would also echo Nontando in relation to really just imploring states, and particularly Zimbabwe, to not negate the instrumental nature of women. During the conversation, we've touched on why it is so important to have women at the center of these processes. So not negating that and making sure that it is intersectional and inclusive, intergenerational, but most importantly that it really be community-led. Let the community be supported in identifying the problems that exist, in designing the solutions, and in designing and really in operationalizing those solutions, in order to promote agency as well in our different contexts. I think people in communities know their circumstances best. So it's just facilitating their voices.
Well, thank you, Ramatu. Thank you, Nontando. This has been a very, very interesting conversation. We've come to a close now. Please join me in thanking Nontando for this presentation. And Nontando, we look forward to seeing the final research. For those of you who are online, you will find the final research and the papers or blogs that she will publish from this on our website shortly. And I look forward to hearing more from you, not only here at the Wilson Center, but when you're back in South Africa as you continue your work on this research. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us.